The household, and the polis as the community of such households, requires a material base, and for this the art of generating wealth will be necessary. What's the relationship between the art of obtaining wealth, chrematistics, and the art of household management, economics? Are they the same thing, or is one a part of the other? Aristotle thinks it's obvious that they cannot be the same thing, since household management uses wealth and does so in a constitutive way. He distinguishes between two kinds of wealth acquisition. There is the acquisition of those things that are necessary for any household. These must be found at hand or produced. Such things, says Aristotle, are the elements of true riches, for the amount of property which is needed for a good life is not unlimited. But there is another kind of acquisition, more properly called the art of wealth getting, which is related to but not identical with the former kind of acquisition, and so easily confused with it. Whereas the first kind of acquisition is natural, the second kind is artificial. To explain what he means, Aristotle distinguishes between the two uses that can be made of anything, one proper and primary, the other improper and secondary. The proper and primary use of a shoe is for wearing on your foot. An improper and secondary use of a shoe is for exchange. Trade, then, or exchange, is not, according to Aristotle, part of the first, natural kind of acquisition. We can see this if we look at the first community, the family. In the family, everything is held and used in the kind of commonality, and trade has no place. Even when the family ramifies and practices a kind of barter exchange, this is not the second kind of acquisition, but just a slightly more complicated version of the natural mode of acquisition. The artificial mode of acquisition Aristotle sees as deriving from long-distance trading, which, he thinks, inevitably gives rise to money. For the various necessaries of life are not easily carried about, he says, and hence men agreed to employ in their dealing with each other something which was intrinsically useful and easily applicable to the purpose of life, for example, iron, silver, and the like. Of this the value was at first measured simply by size and the weight, but in the process of time they put a stamp upon it to save the trouble of weighing and to mark the value. Aristotle correctly distinguishes money from wealth. He says, "He who is rich in coin may often be in want of necessary food, but how can that be wealth of which a man may have a great abundance and yet perish with hunger?" While the natural mode of acquisition has intrinsic limits, the artificial mode has none, and this, Aristotle thinks, is dangerous, leading men to think that money-making in the service of the satisfaction of insatiable desires is the end of life. He says, hence, some persons are led to believe that getting wealth is the object of household management, and the whole idea of their lives is that they ought either to increase their money without limit, or at any rate not to lose it. The origin of this disposition in men is that they are intent upon living only, and not upon living well. And as their desires are unlimited, they also desire that the means of gratifying them should be without limit. Those who do aim at a good life seek the means of obtaining bodily pleasures, and since the enjoyment of these appears to depend upon property, they are absorbed in getting wealth. And so there arise the second species of wealth-getting. For as their enjoyment is in excess, they seek an art which produces the excess of enjoyment. And if they are not able to supply their pleasures by the art of getting wealth, they try other arts, using in turn every faculty in a manner contrary to nature. Aristotle leaves us in no doubt as to what he thinks about all this. The wealth-getting which is part of household management is both necessary and honourable. Wealth-getting via exchange is, he says, justly censured, for it is unnatural and a mode by which men gain from one another. The most hated sort is usury, which makes a gain out of money itself, and not from the natural object of it. For money was intended to be used in exchange, but not to increase at interest. And this term interest, which means the birth of money from money, is applied to the breeding of money because the offspring resembles the parent. Wherefore, of all modes of getting wealth, This is the most unnatural. Aristotle is broadly correct in his account of the origin of money, but wildly off the mark in his application of a natural/unnatural distinction to its use. His attitude is fairly typical of the approach taken to such matters not only by aristocratic Greeks, but by most ruling classes throughout history. He is deeply distrustful of money-making and trade. Whereas the agricultural way of life sets some natural limits to men's desire for wealth, the use of goods for exchange rather than for consumption, made possible largely by money, has a tendency to make the acquisition of wealth an end in itself, and this, Aristotle thinks, is corrosive of the values of the polis. A man governs his children by a royal rule. The rule of the freeman over the slave is yet again different. Aristotle writes, "The freeman rules over the slave after another manner from that in which the male rules over the female, or the man over the child. Although the parts of the souls are present in all of them, they are present in different degrees. For the slave has no deliberative faculty at all. The woman has, but it is without authority, and the child has, but it is immature." In constitutional rule, citizens are ruled and rule in turn. There are natural situations in which the distinction between ruler and ruled emerges. Parents-children, husband-wife, master-slave. Political rule, however, is the relationship between equals, and so the common mistake, a mistake made by Plato and by Confucianism, of taking the family as the microcosm of the state is to be rejected. In Book 2 of the Politics, Aristotle turns his attention to what has already been written about the polis. In the Republic, Plato, through Socrates, wants to have wives and children and property held in common. Aristotle thinks this is a mistake. Having wives and children be common to all will destroy natural affection. If children are nobodies in particular, then no one will pay proper attention to them. In trying to make all his citizens absolutely alike, Plato fails to appreciate that there can be too much unity in a polis. Uniformity is neither necessary nor desirable. Moreover, the abolition of property will not only not remove the source of dissension, it is likely to produce even more. He writes, "That which is common to the greatest number has the least care bestowed upon it. Every one thinks chiefly of his own, hardly at all of the common interest." The basic question is whether or not the citizens in a perfect state should have their possessions in common or not. Aristotle notes that there is always a difficulty in men living together and having all human relations in common, but especially in their having common property. In the end, what Aristotle is recommending is private property regime, but one in which it is used for the common good. He says, "It is clearly better that property should be private, but the use of it common." The polis is not an individual. It is a functional composite of its citizens. So, what is a citizen? The answer to this question will differ depending upon which form of government one is considering. Aristotle's answer to his own question is, in brief, that a citizen is he who has the power to take part in the deliberative or judicial administration of any state. The state or polis being a body of such citizens sufficing for the purposes of life. On this definition, most citizens, so-called, of modern representative democracies would not be considered by Aristotle actually to be citizens, since they lack the power or right to take part in the deliberations and judicial administration. Only those actually in Congress or Parliament, and perhaps not even all of these, do voting fodder backbenchers really count, would meet the terms of this definition. How is it possible to attribute actions to a composite entity such as a state or polis? Aristotle notes that some will refuse to carry out the terms of contracts on the grounds that the tyrant and not the state contracted them. What, he asks, makes a polis to be the same polis from one moment to the next? Is it having the same inhabitants or occupying the same territory? Aristotle dismisses this material account as superficial. Not surprisingly, his own account is formal. He writes, "Since the state, polis, is a partnership, and is a partnership of citizens in a constitution, when the form of the government changes and becomes different, then it may be supposed that the state or polis is no longer the same." Anticipating a difficulty already mentioned as to whether or not the contracts and presumably decisions, treaties and the like, arranged by one regime are binding on the successor regime, which gives a different form or constitution to the same inhabitants occupying the same territory, Aristotle uncharacteristically simply refuses to give an answer. It is quite another question, he says, whether a state ought or ought not to fulfill engagements when the form of government changes. We saw that, for Plato, the end of the polis is the life of virtue of its citizens. The same is true in general for Aristotle. However, he is aware of a problem that only becomes fully articulated in the passage of time. Is a good man necessarily a good citizen? Is a good citizen necessarily a good man? He notes that while all citizens of the polis must contribute to its end, not all of them can be expected to do so in the same way or to the same extent. However, each citizen is expected to carry out his private business well and to have the virtues associated with so doing. He concludes, all must have the virtue of the good citizen. Thus, and thus only, can the state be perfect. But they will not have the virtue of a good man, unless we assume that in the good state all the citizens must be good. This modest gap between man as a citizen and man as anything else, carpenter, accountant, is something that will become ever more important as time goes by. Only in the perfect state will there be a perfect coincidence of the virtuous man and the virtuous citizen. A constant theme of the politics is that in a constitutional polis, rulers and ruled are fundamentally interchangeable. This is the only kind of rule that can be exercised by freemen. It's true that Aristotle's conception of what constitutes a freeman is severely limited. No women, no children, no slaves, no foreigners. But his formal point is worth considering. The task of the ruler in a constitutional polis is to be, for the time being, first among equals. When the time comes, the ruler returns to being one of the ruled. He writes, "There is a rule of another kind, which is exercised over freemen and equals by birth, a constitutional rule, which the ruler must learn by obeying, as he would learn the duties of a general of cavalry by being under the orders of a general of cavalry. It has been well said that he who has never learned to obey cannot be a good commander. The two are not the same, but the good citizen ought to be capable of both. He should know how to govern like a freeman and how to obey like a freeman." Given that constitutional rule involves turn and turnabout, those incapable of taking part in such activities cannot really be considered to be citizens. So children, for example, cannot be full citizens. Neither, however, can those whose work prevents them from taking part in deliberation, such as manual workers. Aristotle writes, "It must be admitted that we cannot consider all those to be citizens who are necessary to the existence of the state. In ancient times, and among some nations, the artisan class were slaves or foreigners, and therefore the majority of them are so now. The best form of the state will not admit them to citizenship." Aristotle admits that matters vary from state to state, some having a more relaxed attitude to citizenship than others, so that in some cases labourers and mechanics can be citizens, but in the end he is unwilling to allow that in the best polis artisans or mechanics or manual labourers can be citizens. Aristotle now returns to some matters already discussed. Is there only one form of government or many? If many, what are the differences between them? He repeats his claim that man is a creature of the polis. He would live with others even if he didn't need another's help, although Aristotle concedes that our need for assistance helps to bind us together. The chief end of both individuals and states is well-being. He repeats the point made on several occasions already. When the state is framed upon the principles of equality and likeness, the citizens think that they ought to hold office by turns. Formerly, everyone would take his turn of service, and then again somebody else would look after his interests, just as he, while in office, had looked after theirs. Aristotle takes over from Plato's statesman the sixfold classification of forms of government created by a matrix of rule by one, by the few and by the many, that's along one side, and rule for the good of the ruler and rule for the good of the ruled along the other side. Rule by the one, if it's for the sake of the ruled, is monarchy. If it's for the sake of the ruler, it's tyranny. Rule by the few, if it's for the sake of the ruled, is aristocracy. If for the sake of the ruler, it's oligarchy. Ruled by the many, if it is for the sake of the ruled, is moderate democracy. If it's for the sake of the ruler, it's extreme democracy. This classification is somewhat mechanical and not particularly insightful. The distinction between rule by the few and rule by the many doesn't really show that what is at issue here is whether political power comes from property and wealth, aristocracy, oligarchy, or from the claims of the many to some kind of consideration, moderate or extreme democracy. To displace the problem of political rule from the number of those exercising power to a system of law seemingly independent of individuals simply pushes the issue back a step, for now the question becomes, who makes or molds the law? Even if it is true that a good state should be governed according to law, it is perfectly possible to have bad laws, and thus to have a lawfully governed bad state. In his discussion of these various possibilities, Aristotle notes that the form of government can actually conceal more than it reveals. There is nothing to prevent a nominally democratic government from ruling in an oligarchic fashion, or a nominally oligarchic government from ruling democratically. I've remarked that Plato tended to run ethics, economics, politics, and law together in his conception of the polis. We find the same tendency in Aristotle, but also a countervailing tendency to distinguish these elements. There is a dawning recognition that to be a good citizen and a good person is not necessarily the same thing, that politics and ethics may in fact be distinct. We find further the beginnings of a discrimination between political structures and law and between political structures and economics. However, the distinction in which all these other distinctions are summed up, the distinction between society and the state, a foundational principle of liberalism in both its classic and libertarian variety, is hardly one that we could reasonably expect a classical Greek thinker to appreciate. Sabine remarks, "The modern distinction between the state and society is one which no Greek thinker made clearly and adequately, and which perhaps could not be made until the state was conceived as a legal structure. But Aristotle at least reached a very good first approximation to it." Aristotle concedes, however, that ultimately it's not numbers that matter, but whether the poor rule or the rich rule. As a matter of fact, more often than not, the rich and the few coincide, and the poor and the many do so too. But this is an accidental connection. There is nothing to prevent the many being rich or the few being poor. He writes, whether in oligarchies or in democracies, the number of the governing body, whether the greater number, as in a democracy, or the smaller number, as in an oligarchy, is an accident due to the fact that the rich everywhere are few and the poor numerous. The real difference between democracy and oligarchy is poverty and wealth. In the clash between the rich and the poor, we find that they agree formally on the principle of distributive justice, which is that equals should receive equal. They differ, however, in what they consider to be relevant to the determination of equality. Lord writes, "The former, oligarchs, believes the inequality in wealth justifies unequal treatment generally, the latter, democrats, that equality in freedom requires equal treatment in all respects." It is important to make it clear that the claim to equal treatment by the many is not based upon some abstract conception of human rights, but upon the fact that every citizen has a duty to risk his life in defense of the polis, and thus should have a say in determining its policies and its laws.